Texas is known for its tough-on-crime stance, and no place in America has executed more people. But behind the prison walls, among the death row cells, are women whose crimes are so chilling they've stunned even the toughest prosecutors. From mothers who killed their own blood to women who murdered for greed, addiction, or just cruelty. These are not only killers, these are some of the most evil women to ever live behind bars in Texas. Ashley Grayson. Ashley Grayson was one of those rising online stars, a 35-year-old entrepreneur from Dallas, Texas, who turned her internet business into a buzzing platform of followers, fame, and financial success. But behind the viral posts and online influence was a woman so consumed by her virtual rivalries that she plotted murder to protect her image. It started with suspicion. Ashley believed a fellow online businesswoman from South Haven, Mississippi, someone she'd never even met in person, was behind a string of fake profiles that targeted her with criticism and hate. To Ashley, this wasn't just trolling, it was war, and she decided she wouldn't fight it with lawsuits or Instagram callouts. In September 2022, Ashley invited a woman she knew from Memphis to Dallas, claiming she had a business opportunity to discuss. The woman came, bringing her husband with her, but what they heard over dinner wasn't an offer to join a company. It was a contract to kill. Ashley wanted 3 people dead: her Mississippi rival, an ex-boyfriend, and another woman in Texas who had made online remarks that offended her. She promised at least $20,000 per hit and offered an extra $5,000 to speed things up. The Memphis couple played along but secretly began working with federal agents. They recorded Ashley confirming the hit order and even sent her a staged photo of police lights, pretending they'd tried but failed to carry out the murder. In return, Ashley and her husband handed them $10,000 in cash for an attempted kill. It was enough to bring down her empire. In July 2023, both Ashley and her husband, Joshua Grayson, were indicted by a grand jury for use of interstate facility in commission of murder for hire, a federal offense. The trial that followed in March 2024, Joshua walked free, acquitted by the jury, but Ashley wasn't so lucky. She was found guilty and on October 31st, 2024, received the maximum sentence, 120 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. There's no parole in the federal system. Ashley Grayson would serve nearly every day of those 10 years. This was a 21st century crime. Acting U.S. Attorney Reagan Fondren said, "Online feuds and senseless rivalries bled into the real world. And while no one died, the emotional toll on the intended victim and her family was heavy." The FBI and the ATF, along with Assistant U.S. Attorneys Neil Oldham and Bryce Phillips, worked together to stop what could have been a devastating act of violence driven by ego, paranoia, and obsession. Kimberly McCarthy. She looked like any other neighbor, warm, familiar, even friendly. But behind Kimberly McCarthy's seemingly ordinary smile lurked a dark hunger that couldn't be satisfied. Not with kindness, not with love, but with drugs, violence, and blood. It was July 21st, 1997, when McCarthy made a simple call to her elderly neighbor, 71-year-old Dorothy Booth. "I'm coming over to borrow some sugar," she said. The two women had known each other for years. Dorothy, a retired psychology professor, didn't hesitate to let her in. But what walked through her front door that day wasn't a neighbor, it was a predator. Once inside, McCarthy launched into a brutal, calculated attack. She stabbed Dorothy 5 times with a butcher knife, bludgeoned her with a heavy candelabrum, and then, coldly, deliberately, cut off the woman's ring finger to steal her diamond wedding ring. After the savage killing, McCarthy drove off in Dorothy's Mercedes-Benz. used her credit cards to buy liquor, and pawned the ring for drug money. It was a chilling murder, but what came next made the case even more disturbing. As police searched McCarthy's home, they recovered the murder weapon, still carrying Dorothy's DNA, and discovered Booth's driver's license and other stolen belongings. Surveillance footage tied McCarthy to the use of the stolen credit cards. The evidence was overwhelming. But during her trial, an even darker truth emerged. Prosecutors revealed blood evidence linking McCarthy to 2 additional murders of elderly women, Maggie Harding and Jetty Lucas, both killed in 1988 under eerily similar circumstances. Though never officially charged in those cases, the message was clear. Dorothy Booth wasn't her first victim. She may have been her last, but she wasn't the only one. In 1998, McCarthy was sentenced to death. She appealed and briefly succeeded in overturning the verdict in 2001, but justice wasn't finished with her. The following year, she was retried and once again sentenced to die. For years, she maintained her innocence, claiming she'd been framed, but no new evidence ever backed up her claims. On June 26, 2013, Kimberly McCarthy was executed by lethal injection in Huntsville, Texas. She made history in a gruesome way, becoming the 500th person executed by Texas since the reinstatement of the death penalty. Andrea Yates. It's the kind of story that haunts people for decades. A quiet suburban home, a young mother, and 5 lifeless children pulled from a bathtub. In June 2001, the nation stood still as news broke from Houston, Texas. Andrea Yates, a 36-year-old mother of 5, had drowned all of her children, one by one, in their family home. On the morning of June 20, 2001, while her husband was away at work and her mother-in-law delayed by errands, Andrea filled the bathtub. She began with the youngest, 6-month-old Mary. Then came Luke, Paul, John, and finally Noah. Her oldest son tried to run when he realized what was happening, but Andrea chased him down. She laid each of her children side by side on the bed, except for Noah, whom she left floating in the tub. Then Andrea picked up the phone and calmly dialed 911. Married in 1993 and pledged to live by their deeply evangelical Christian values. That included one major decision. They would have as many babies as nature allowed. Andrea gave birth to their first child, Noah, in 1994, but what followed was a cycle of pregnancies, relocations, and growing instability. By the time their 3rd child arrived, the Yates family had gone from a house in Friendswood to a trailer in Florida, and finally to a motorhome in Houston. Life was cramped, stressful, and emotionally draining. After the birth of her 4th son, Luke, in 1999, Andrea's fragile state shattered completely. One morning, Rusty found her shaking and chewing her fingers. The next day, she was hospitalized from a pill overdose. Weeks later, she threatened to take her life again. Doctors prescribed antipsychotics, which seemed to work. Hoping to give Andrea stability, Rusty, her husband, moved the family out of the motorhome and into a small house. But it wasn't enough. In the summer of 1999, Andrea suffered a complete nervous breakdown. 2 more attempts and multiple psychiatric hospitalizations followed. She was officially diagnosed with postpartum psychosis. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Eileen Starbranch, warned the couple in no uncertain terms. Another pregnancy would almost certainly trigger another mental collapse. But just 7 weeks after Andrea's discharge, she was pregnant again. Andrea gave birth to her 5th and final child, a daughter named Mary, in November in the year 2000. For a while, it seemed like she might be okay, but then her father passed away in March 2001. That loss sent Andrea into a spiral. She stopped taking her medication. She began mutilating herself. She read the Bible obsessively and stopped feeding her infant daughter. On April 1st, Andrea was placed under the care of Dr. Mohammed Saeed. He discharged her after treatment, but her condition deteriorated rapidly. On May 3rd, she filled the bathtub in the middle of the day, her first attempt to carry out what she would later call her plan. She admitted to police that she had intended to drown her children that day, but backed out at the last moment. Rusty was unaware of just how close she had come. The next day, Andrea was hospitalized again, this time after a doctor's visit revealed she was barely responsive, a near catatonic state. Her psychiatrist believed she had filled the tub to drown herself, not knowing she had meant to use it for her children. By the time June rolled around, Andrea was released once more. Just weeks later, on June 20th, she finally carried out the act she had planned for months. What began as untreated mental illness escalated into one of the most disturbing crimes in Texas history. And it all unfolded in the quiet suburbs, inside a modest home, behind the mask of a mother who was crying for help, until it was too late. Andrea told psychiatrists she waited for Rusty to leave that morning because she knew he would stop her. She even caged the family dog so it wouldn't interfere with her plan. She believed her children were doomed and that she had to kill them to save them from eternal damnation. Her mental state wasn't in question. Psychiatrists on both sides, defense and prosecution, agreed she was deeply psychotic, but Texas law is strict. To be declared legally insane, Andrea had to prove that she didn't know right from wrong at the moment of the killings. The jury didn't believe she met that standard. In March 2002, Andrea Yates was found guilty of capital murder. The prosecution pushed for the death penalty, but the jury instead sentenced her to life in prison with parole eligibility after 40 years. Then, 3 years later, everything changed. A shocking twist unraveled her conviction. A prosecution expert, Dr. Park Dietz, had testified that Andrea might have been inspired by an episode of Law and Order, in which a woman drowned her children and was found not guilty by reason of insanity. But the episode never existed. Author and journalist Suzanne O'Malley, who had written for the show, exposed the lie. The appellate court ruled the false testimony could have swayed the jury and overturned the conviction. In 2006, Andrea faced a second trial. This time, the result was different. After 3 days of deliberations, the jury found her not guilty by reason of insanity. She was sent to the North Texas State Hospital, then later transferred to a low-security mental health facility in Kerrville. Kimberly Cargill. Kimberly Cargill wasn't a name most people knew until the night she set fire to a body on a lonely Texas road. The year was 2010, and Cargill, a 43-year-old mother from White House, Texas, was already on the radar of Child Protective Services. She'd been accused of abuse, and 2 of her young sons had been taken from her care. With a court date looming and her custody hanging by a thread, Cargill was desperate, and in her desperation, she made a choice so chilling, so calculated, it stunned even seasoned detectives. Her target was Cherry Walker, a kind, mentally challenged woman who had babysat for Cargill's son. Cherry had been subpoenaed to testify in Cargill's custody hearing. She didn't understand all the legal details, but she knew she was nervous. She didn't want to cause trouble. Cargill, sensing her anxiety, made an offer that sounded like a lifeline. "Come with me," she said. "I'll keep you safe. You won't have to testify." But what Cherry didn't know was that she wasn't coming back. That night, Cargill drove Cherry out under the pretense of having dinner. Somewhere along the way, something went horribly wrong, or perhaps just as planned. Cherry Walker died of asphyxiation. Whether by hands or another method, she was silenced forever. Cargill then drove her lifeless body 8 miles outside of town, poured lighter fluid over her clothes, and set her ablaze. She left Cherry's lifeless body on the side of the road. It took investigators 4 days to identify the remains, but once they did, suspicion quickly turned toward Kimberly Cargill. She had motive, she had opportunity, and she had a long documented history of rage. During her trial in 2012, Cargill insisted she didn't kill Cherry. She claimed her babysitter had suffered a seizure and died in the car, right outside a hospital where Cargill just couldn't find the entrance. She said she panicked, but her story unraveled fast. The medical examiner testified that Cherry died from asphyxiation, consistent with homicide, not seizure. Her past seizures, doctors noted, were never severe or life-threatening, and when the jury heard how Cargill tried to cover it all up by setting the body on fire, their verdict was swift: guilty of capital murder. During sentencing, the truth about Kimberly Cargill got even darker. Forensic psychiatrists described her as dangerously impulsive, angry, and remorseless, with traits of narcissism, antisocial behavior, and psychopathy. Her IQ was above average. She knew exactly what she was doing. Her own sons testified against her. So did her ex-husbands. They spoke of years of abuse, of being choked, locked in rooms, kicked and hit by the woman who was supposed to love them. On May 31, 2012, Kimberly Cargill was sentenced to death by lethal injection. And while she's filed appeal after appeal, all denied, her fate remains sealed. As of 2025, she sits on Texas death row, still awaiting the day of her execution. She's one of the few women in Texas history to be sentenced to death, and the only white woman in the state awaiting execution for killing an African-American victim. If and when her day comes, she'll enter history once again as one of Texas's most cold-blooded killers. Brittany Holberg. In the quiet neighborhood of southwest Amarillo, Texas, no one could have guessed that the home of an elderly man would become the setting of one of the state's most gruesome and hotly debated murders. At the center of it all was Brittany Marlowe Holberg, once a struggling young woman with a history of drug addiction and prostitution, now one of the most notorious women to ever sit on Texas death row. It was November 13, 1996, when 80-year-old A.B. Towery Sr. was found dead in his home. But this wasn't a simple murder. It was a scene out of a horror movie. He'd been stabbed nearly 60 times. His face was bruised and battered. For investigators, it was clear this wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. This was rage, pure, horrifying rage. And the name that kept coming up? Brittany Holberg. According to prosecutors, Holberg had planned the attack to steal money and prescription drugs from the elderly man who had been paying her for getting intimate with him. Witnesses claimed they saw her flaunting a large amount of cash after the killing. But Holberg had a different story, a story that complicated everything. She claimed it was self-defense. In her version, Towery attacked her with a frying pan after catching her smoking drugs in his apartment. She said they struggled. He pulled out strands of her hair and she snapped. What followed, she insisted, wasn't murder, it was survival. But how could self-defense explain the brutality of the killing? The court didn't buy it. Holberg fled to Tennessee and was arrested 3 months later in Memphis. At her trial, a key witness named Vicki Kirkpatrick, an informant for the Amarillo police, testified that Holberg had coldly confessed to the killing, even describing it as fun and amazing. That statement sealed Holberg's fate. She was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. But the case didn't end there. Years later, in 2011, Kirkpatrick dropped a bombshell. She claimed her testimony had been coerced. She said prosecutors threatened her with a burglary charge if she didn't testify against Holberg. The jury never knew Kirkpatrick was a paid informant, and that missing detail would change everything. In March 2025, nearly 30 years after the murder, a federal appeals court overturned Holberg's conviction. The court ruled that withholding Kirkpatrick's informant status had violated Holberg's right to a fair trial. While some judges believed the physical evidence alone was enough to convict her, others felt the betrayal of justice was too deep to ignore. Holberg's case was sent back to the trial court, and now her fate hangs in the balance once more. Melissa Lucio. When Melissa Lucio was sentenced to death in 2008 for the brutal murder of her 2-year-old daughter Mariah, the case seemed open and shut. Prosecutors painted her as a violent, neglectful mother who had beaten her toddler to death, leaving her body covered in bruises and internal injuries. But beneath the surface, Lucio's case was anything but simple. And over the years, it has become one of the most controversial capital cases in Texas history. Lucio's daughter, Mariah, was found lifeless in their home in 2007. Prosecutors said it was a clear case of physical abuse, but Lucio claimed Mariah had fallen down a steep flight of stairs days before her death. That story might have held more weight, if not for what happened during the interrogation. For over 7 hours, Lucio was interrogated by Texas Ranger Victor Escalon without a lawyer, food, or water. She denied abusing Mariah over 100 times, but under intense pressure and what many have called psychological coercion, she eventually said, "I guess I did it. I'm responsible." That so-called confession became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. But was it a confession or a product of trauma? Lucio had a long history of abuse and had lived a life defined by poverty, addiction, and domestic violence. Experts later argued that her subdued behavior and willingness to say what police wanted to hear was typical of abuse survivors. Her defenders say she didn't confess. She submitted. During the trial, the defense was barred from presenting expert testimony on the effects of trauma, testimony that could have explained Lucio's behavior during interrogation. The jury never heard it. They also didn't know that one of Lucio's sons told investigators he saw Mariah fall down the stairs. That evidence, too, was barely touched in court. Then there was the pathologist, Dr. Norma Farley, who insisted Mariah's injuries could not have come from a fall. But another expert doctor, Thomas Young, later reviewed the evidence and concluded Farley had jumped to wrong conclusions. And this wasn't the first time. Farley had made similarly controversial claims in another wrongful conviction that was eventually overturned. In the years following her conviction, Lucio's case gained national attention. In 2020, the documentary The State of Texas vs. Melissa exposed shocking flaws in the investigation and trial. It sparked public outcry and even bipartisan support in the Texas legislature. When her execution date was set for April 2022, over 80 Texas lawmakers urged Governor Greg Abbott to intervene, calling it a miscarriage of justice. With just 2 days to spare, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted a stay of execution. In 2024, the same judge who presided over her original trial, Arturo Nelson, recommended a new trial, citing newly discovered evidence and the prosecution's failure to disclose key facts. Now the case is back in the hands of the Court of Criminal Appeals. So what's the truth about Melissa Lucio? Is she a brutal killer or a broken woman railroaded by a system that failed to protect her and her child? Her fate, once again, hangs in the balance. From brutal stabbings to calculated cover-ups, these women committed crimes that still haunt Texas to this day. But as the years pass and new evidence surfaces, the line between guilt and injustice grows thinner. Are all of them truly evil, or are some victims of a broken system? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you've made it this far, be sure to check out this next video. I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you once again for watching.